With us now, Washington correspondent for Spectrum News, Kevin Frey. Kevin, good morning to you. Let's start with these emails because the last time these went out, there were several departments and agencies who said, don't respond to that, pause or ignore it. There was a lot of confusion about what they'd be used for. Is it any clearer now, the purpose of these emails?
I think we have to watch over the next few hours to see if we once again repeat this sort of scenario where some of the agencies come out and say, actually, you don't need to do this, which set up this sort of friction between Elon Musk and particularly some of those that deal with national security, where you saw even Trump allies that have basically pledged to work for Trump at the FBI, the NSA, the list goes on, advising the employees to slow walk this and don't necessarily engage. It seems there might be a call for the employees to essentially say, I deal with national security matters, so we're going to leave it at that. But even that raises new questions. And keep in mind, the employees in the midst of all of this are kind of experiencing a degree of whiplash. I remember after the first time one of these went out, an employee I was texting with at one of the federal agencies basically said her anxiety level is at a higher level than it's ever been. And so this does create this kind of constant sense of confusion.
Yeah, and Musk described them as a literal pulse check to make sure that people were alive. I guess he's checking now every week to determine if they're still alive because they've got to send in these bullet points. 4 dozen agency sites, the lease terminations for these facilities have been listed by DOJ. And Renee went through the layoffs at NOAA and Social Security Administration. Could this hurt budget negotiations? We're just a couple of weeks out from running out of money.
Yeah, I mean, and this has caused a lot of confusion as the negotiations are ongoing. And basically both sides have different factors at play. For the Republicans, the question becomes, okay, do we pass legislation that basically refunds all of the agencies that Trump and DOJ have tried to basically carve out? And Trump has added confusion to this, it's worth noting, by suggesting that they pass a, quote, clean CR, which raises all sorts of questions as to whether or not that means fully funding things as they were previously before DOJ got involved. For the Democrats, you have seen on their end of things, they've been trying to push to include in the bill some sort of check on Elon Musk and DOJ's power, some guardrails around him. That's kind of a non-starter to some extent for Republicans, and you have to raise questions as to whether Trump would even sign off on that. But do Democrats go as far as they can on the mat on this and potentially force a government shutdown? Because we know at the end of the day on Capitol Hill, it's very unlikely that the Republicans, given their numbers and their margins, can really do this alone. They need Democratic votes to overcome the filibuster in the Senate. And on the House side, there are historically some Republicans that will not vote for a sort of short-term stopgap funding bills. And so they're going to need Democratic support. And so this does create the opportunity for an impasse, and the blame game is already starting to get underway beforehand, which is never a good sign.
Yeah, and Democrats haven't reached consensus on their strategy yet, still talking that through. Let's talk about this Oval Office meeting yesterday. I remember there were times during the first Trump term when Vice President Pence would try to disappear into the upholstery, right? He was so silent and so still that it seemed intentional that he didn't want to get involved. That is not the Vance way, obviously. What did we learn yesterday about the approach to the role that Vance takes and what the president allows or delegates to Vice President Vance?
Right. I mean, some of this was kind of Vance's really first big push in the kind of media space, because, I mean, he obviously did the speech at the Munich Security Conference where he raised some eyebrows about some of his comments about political parties in Germany, to say the least. But this was kind of his first chance to engage in a way that really has grabbed headlines. And keep in mind, he's essentially been playing second fiddle to Elon Musk in terms of dominating the headlines over the past few months. And so this was sort of his coming out party in that sense. And clearly, he's sort of played the role, and this has led to all sorts of questions as to whether or not this was coordinated or an improvised moment, of basically being Trump's enforcer and arguably kind of helping start the real squabble that we saw there in the Oval Office in those last few minutes. I will stress, though, when it comes to Vance, in terms of his ideology on Ukraine, this isn't all that surprising that he would be leaning in, trying to be the president's defender, because he has previously, going back to 2022, he was quoted as saying, I believe on Steve Bannon's podcast or something to that effect, that I don't really care what happens in Ukraine. So he already had disillusionment, unlike some of his fellow Republicans, about Ukraine long before entering the White House.
Let's talk about your reporting. The president is taking what some are calling a revenge tour of New York City. Far more interest in the issues there than he was in his first term. What are you learning?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously Trump is a man of New York City. He was born and raised there, but he also has this sort of odd friction with the city because, one, people there politically don't really accept him. He was born in one of the outer boroughs and always wanted to be accepted in Manhattan as a real estate broker, but even the real estate circles didn't really accept him historically. And then add on top of that, this was the town that slapped him with various felony counts when the jury weighed in and found him guilty. And so some observers are arguing that he's basically on a revenge tour, and he's been hyper involved in New York in the last few weeks, far more so, some would argue, than he was during his first term in office, including, among other things, obviously shutting down congestion pricing, which is this key initiative that lawmakers are pursuing to try to reduce traffic in lower Manhattan and also raise money for the subway system, and also pulling back funding to help the city deal with the migrant crisis. On top of that, of course, the DOJ has been getting involved heavily in New York, both with suing the city and suing the state over immigration policies. And then, basically getting involved in the mayor's corruption case and trying to strip away the charges away from him, while arguably trying to basically force the mayor to do their will when it comes to immigration. This is a hyper involvement, and it's created the impression amongst, I should say, some Democrats that Trump is basically singling in on New York because of his frustration there. Republicans, I should say, push back and say Biden set up a lot of issues in New York, and he is fulfilling his campaign promises by stepping in this capacity. 5.5
weeks in, and we already have 4 or 5 bullet points on that New York list. Kevin Frey with Spectrum News. Exactly. Thanks so much for being with us.